Before 3 days had passed, a 21-year-old soldier that half the base called nothing more than the girl who fixes rifles would put 26 men on the ground from a distance most officers on that post could not calculate in their heads. And the man who laughed her out of a briefing room would be the first one standing in the doorway of her quarters asking for forgiveness. That is where this story ends. This is where it begins. Captain Wade Sorensen stood at the front of the operations room with a laser pointer in one hand and a cup of coffee going cold in the other. And when Specialist Tegan Voss's name came up on the assignment board for the forward observation slot, he laughed loud enough to bounce off the cinder block walls. "Voss for Overwatch," he said, shaking his head like a man who had just been told the funniest thing he would hear all week. "Not my problem. Send someone with actual trigger time." The room laughed with him because that is what rooms do when the man in charge sets the tone. Somebody near the back muttered something about paperwork and radio checks, and it got a chuckle from 3 other soldiers. And Tegan sat with her spine straight and her hands flat on the table and said absolutely nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the loudest man in a room is rarely the one who understands what is actually in it. Before we go any further, if this is the first time you have found your way to this story, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and stay with it all the way to the end. Because what happens to Tegan Voss over the next 36 hours is going to change the way you think about every quiet soldier you have ever underestimated. And drop a comment telling me what state you are watching from tonight. I want to know how far this one travels. Fort Calder Range sat on a stretch of high Wyoming plateau where the wind never stopped moving and the nearest town was 90 minutes away on a road that closed twice a winter. It was a training installation built for hard weather and harder lessons. The kind of post where soldiers were sent to be broken down and rebuilt, where respect was not handed out with rank insignia, but earned through volume and swagger, and the willingness to talk over anyone quieter than you. Tegan had been stationed there 7 months. 7 months of equipment maintenance logs, 7 months of radio checks completed on time, every time, without a single complaint filed against her, and without a single word of praise offered in return. She was 21 years old, 5'6", with pale blonde hair she kept pinned tight against her skull, and eyes the color of weathered stone that never seemed to blink at the wrong moment. She was not loud. She was not looking to be noticed. She moved through the base the way a blade moves inside its sheath, completely still, completely contained, completely ready, in a way that had nothing to do with performance. Most of the soldiers at Fort Calder had decided who Tegan Voss was within the first 48 hours of meeting her. Quiet, probably fine behind a desk, good with a wrench, bad with a rifle. Sergeant First Class Vera Lindqvist, who had been at the post 6 years and had seen every kind of soldier pass through its gates, had said it plainly during Tegan's first week while leaning against the armory wall with a cigarette she never lit. "She seems like the type you keep in the motor pool," Lindqvist had said. Reliable, not exactly Overwatch material. Nobody argued because that was the comfortable version of Tegan Voss, and comfortable versions of people require no further examination. The problem with comfortable versions is that they are almost never true. Tegan's classified service record required a clearance. Most people on that post did not hold, and almost nobody had bothered to request it. Her marksmanship scores from advanced sniper selection were not simply high. They were the kind of numbers instructors kept on file to show new candidates what excellence actually looked like when someone stopped treating it like a suggestion. She had qualified at distances most trained shooters never attempted outside of a controlled range. She had trained through wind, through altitude, through visibility conditions that sent grown men crawling back to fundamentals. Before Fort Calder, she had spent 18 months attached to a long-range reconnaissance element, the kind of assignment nobody talked about at family dinners, because the entire point of the work was to never be seen doing it. You moved through hostile terrain without leaving a trace. You watched without being watched. You gathered intelligence that saved lives. You would never personally meet, filed a report, and disappeared into the next assignment. She had never failed a mission. The man who built that reconnaissance program, the man who had personally trained her through every one of those 18 months, was a warrant officer named Silas Draven. He was the one who taught her patience before he taught her marksmanship, who told her during her 3rd week of selection that most soldiers prepare for the mission they expect, and the ones who build long careers prepare for the mission that surprises them. And he had watched her clean the same weapon twice in a single evening and told her that discipline was not about the big performance. It was about the thousand small unwitnessed repetitions nobody would ever applaud her for. She had taken that lesson and built her entire life around it. Every night, not some nights. Not only the nights before something big. Every night, because you never know which night is the last easy one. 2 years ago, Draven had disappeared from active service under circumstances nobody had ever fully explained to the soldiers who trained beneath him, and Tegan had carried the unanswered shape of that disappearance with her ever since, tucked away in the same quiet corner of her mind where she kept everything she had not yet found a use for. Nobody at Fort Calder knew any of that, and Tegan had never told them. This was the thing people misread about her most consistently. They saw her silence and assumed she had nothing worth saying. They saw her patience and mistook it for passivity. What none of them considered was that she had made a deliberate choice to let the truth reveal itself on its own schedule rather than force it into a room that was not ready to hear it. She had learned something during those 18 months under Draven that most people never learn in a lifetime of chasing attention. The loudest voice in a room is almost never the most accurate one, and the truth, when it finally matters, does not need to be announced. It arrives like a verdict. Sergeant Desmond Price was the one person on that post who paid attention for reasons that had nothing to do with rank or gossip. He was 33, an intelligence analyst by trade, and his entire professional life was built around the discipline of seeing what was actually in front of him instead of what he expected to find there. He had noticed Tegan during his second week at Fort Calder, not in some cinematic instant of recognition, but in the accumulation of small, unremarkable details that together told a very different story than the one everyone else believed. He noticed the way she studied a terrain map, like a problem she intended to solve, rather than a task she was assigned to glance at. He noticed the calm efficiency in her hands whenever she handled a weapon, the total absence of the small hesitations that mark someone who does not fully trust their own competence. He noticed the notebook she kept tucked into her left breast pocket, the one she pulled out only after watching something unfold never before. Each observation on its own meant nothing. Together they built a picture that most of the base had never bothered to look at. One evening, about 6 weeks into his posting, Price found Tegan finishing her equipment checks alone in the motor pool after everyone else had gone to chow. He sat down on a bench near the door and said without any real introduction, "You are a lot more than what they think you are." She kept working, tightening a strap without looking up. "What makes you say that?" she asked. "Because I have spent my career learning to notice things other people miss," he said. "And someone who moves the way you move learned it somewhere real." She set down the equipment and looked at him for the first time, and the look was neither warm nor cold, simply evaluating. The same look she gave terrain before deciding whether it would keep her alive. "Most people do not notice that," she said. "Good," he answered, "because someone should." A silence passed between them before he asked the question that had been building in his mind for weeks. "Why do you let them think you are nothing?" he said. "Your record alone would end every joke in this camp." Tegan turned the equipment over in her hands and checked the calibration, unhurried, as if she had already decided exactly how the conversation would end. "Because the moment will come when they need to know," she said, "and that moment will mean something. Walking into a room and correcting their assumptions does not change anything. It just starts an argument. But when the truth is forced to arrive on its own, people feel it differently. They remember it differently." Price studied her for a long moment. "You have thought about this a great deal," he said. "I have had a lot of time to think," she answered simply. "People do not talk to me much." There was no bitterness in the way she said it. It was closer to an observation about the weather. He felt something shift in his understanding of her, not surprise exactly, more like the satisfaction of a picture finally locking into focus. "When that moment comes," he said, standing, "I want to be the one beside you." She looked at him again with that same honest, weighing gaze. "I know," she said. "That is why I am talking to you." 4 days later, a routine communications training exercise was scheduled to run along the Western Perimeter Road, a stretch of broken terrain the base called the Devil's Ladder for the way it climbed and dropped through blind switchbacks with almost no radio coverage. It was meant to be simple, A convoy would move a mock supply load along the route while a volunteer overwatch position observed from the ridge above. Simple drills like this rarely got anyone's full attention, which was exactly why Sorensen ran them the way he ran everything, with the settled confidence of a man who had never seriously considered that he might be wrong about something important. He stood at the front of the operations room, reading off assignments with practiced efficiency, and when he reached the overwatch slot, someone in the room suggested Tegan Voss. The reasoning was sound. Her communications background meant she understood every protocol involved, and anyone who had actually watched her the way Price had watched her would have found the suggestion obvious. Sorensen looked up from the board, found her in the room, and laughed. Voss for Overwatch. He shook his head, still grinning like a man enjoying an excellent joke. Not my problem. Send someone else. The laughter that followed filled the room and settled into something that felt, from inside it, like simple common sense. Tegan sat through all of it with her spine straight and her hands still and her expression carrying the same calm it always carried. She looked at Sorensen not with anger, but with something closer to clarity, memorizing his face the way you memorize the exact shape of a mistake you know you will need to remember later. Then she stood quietly and walked out. Nobody called after her. In the corridor outside, Private Sam Delgado was coming the other direction. 20 years old and still too new to arrange his face into the practiced neutrality older soldiers wore like armor. He had heard the laughter through the door. Specialist Voss, he said, stopping. That was not right in there. She slowed just enough to meet his eyes. It was not, she agreed, but it does not change my job today. Or tomorrow. She kept walking, and Delgado stood in the corridor for a long moment, watching her go, holding something he had not expected to be handed. That night, a courier Tegan did not recognize arrived at her quarters with a sealed envelope carrying authorization codes above her clearance level. Inside was a single typed line with no signature and no explanation. Delay the western route 36 hours, 0 casualties. Report to no one until contact. She read it twice, then a third time, searching the paper for something she had missed, some context that would make the order make sense. There was none. No unit designation. No name threat. No reason given for why a communications drill along a training road suddenly required an order written in language that belonged to something much larger than a communications drill. She struck a match and burned the paper over the small metal waste bin in her room, watching the edges curl black and fold in on themselves until nothing legible remained. And she sat with the ash for a long time afterward, thinking about the phrase 0 casualties attached to an exercise that was not supposed to have any casualties to begin with. Whoever had written that order was not worried about a training accident. They were worried about something else entirely, something that had not been explained to her, and the not knowing sat in her chest like a stone she would carry until the moment demanded she set it down. She did not sleep much that night. She spent the hours before dawn the way she spent every night that mattered, cleaning her equipment twice, checking calibration on gear that did not need checking, running through terrain data on the Devil's Ladder route until she could see the switchbacks with her eyes closed. She thought once, briefly, of Draven's voice from 2 years earlier, the same lesson returning the way it always did before something dangerous. Every night, not some nights. She had built her entire career on that sentence, and tonight it felt heavier than it ever had before, though she could not yet say why. 80500. The convoy rolled out along the western perimeter road, 3 vehicles carrying a mock supply load and a communications team running through standard check-in protocols. Tegan and Price moved up to the observation ridge 2 hours ahead of schedule, climbing exposed terrain that punished every joint not fully conditioned for altitude, and Price matched her pace step for step without complaint, because 7 weeks of watching her told him this was the kind of day he had been quietly training for without knowing exactly when it would arrive. They reached the ridge, and Tegan configured her position with the seamless economy of someone whose body had stopped treating the sequence as a conscious act years ago. Below them, First Sergeant Marcus Boone commanded the convoy with the settled authority of a man who had run this same drill a dozen times without incident. The check-ins came clean at 053, clean again at 0600, then nothing at 0622. A missed check-in is not automatically alarming. Equipment fails. Terrain swallows signal. You wait, you attempt contact, you escalate, only when the silence stretches past what coincidence can explain. By 0630, the silence had stretched too far. Then the radio cracked open with a transmission that was not clean, not procedural, not anything close to the language of a training exercise. Contact, multiple positions. We are taking real fire. This is not a drill. Someone repeat, this is not a drill. Tegan heard every word of it from the ridge where she had been told 3 days earlier, in front of the entire operations room, that her presence there did not matter. She did not hesitate. She was already moving her eye behind the scope while Price scrambled his spotting equipment into position beside her, his voice steady because he understood that steady was the only thing worth giving her right now. Talk to me, she said. South switchback, he answered. Second bend, irregular movement, not consistent with wind or wildlife. Elevation difference to target, roughly 40 meters drop, range approximately 650 meters. Wind 8 miles per hour, crossing east to west. She held for 4 full seconds, reading the wind, reading the angle, reading the human shape, crouched behind cover with a rifle raised toward Boone's convoy below. She did not want to kill. The order in her head was clear, even without a written page to confirm it. 0 casualties. She adjusted her aim 2 degrees off center mass, exhaled half a breath, held, and fired once. The rifle in the shooter's hands below exploded into fragments as the scope shattered under the impact, the round taking the optic clean off the rail without touching flesh. The man dropped his weapon and scrambled backward into the rocks, unharmed but blind and disarmed in the span of a single heartbeat. Price was already on the radio. Command, this is Price at the observation point. Overwatch is established. Hostile position on the south switchback has been neutralized without casualties. Convoy is clear on that flank. The silence on the other end lasted almost 2 full seconds before Boone's voice came back, tight with disbelief and something close to relief. Say again, who is up there? She is not going to identify herself right now, Price said, but she just saved your convoy without putting a single round through a human body, and you should probably let her keep working. Below, the ambush was not finished. A second position opened up from the tree line near the lead vehicle, and Private First Class Eli Rourke, 22 years old and running on training that had not fully caught up with reality, froze at the wheel of the second truck. His hands locked on the steering column, while his weapon sat forgotten in his lap, and the convoy's return fire scattered wide and undisciplined around him. Tegan watched through her scope, as panic did what panic always does, turning a trained soldier into a liability in the space of a few seconds. Rourke, still finally raised his rifle toward the tree line with shaking hands, his aim swinging wide across the angle where 2 of his own soldiers were repositioning for cover. Close enough that a panicked shot would not find the enemy, it would find them. Tegan made the calculation in less time than it takes to describe it. She could not reach him with a warning. She could not reach him with time. She adjusted, held, and fired a single round that struck the stock of Rourke's rifle at the exact point where his grip met the wood, splitting the stock in half and knocking the weapon clean out of his hands without so much as grazing his fingers. Rourke stared down at his empty hands as if his own body had betrayed him. And in that half second of shock, the discipline finally returned and he dropped low behind the truck frame instead of standing exposed in a panic he no longer had the means to act on. She could have let him fire. She could have let the round land wherever fear decided to send it. And if it had struck one of his own men, the fault would have belonged to him, not to her. And nobody watching from the ridge would have questioned her choice to simply keep tracking the tree line instead. She chose otherwise. She chose to spend a round and a half second of exposed positioning on saving a man from his own mistake instead of letting the mistake run its course. And somewhere in that decision was everything anyone would ever need to understand about who Tegan Voss actually was, underneath 7 months of being told she did not matter. Below, the ambush broke apart within another 90 seconds. The remaining hostile positions withdrawing once it became clear the ridge above them was occupied by someone who could see everything and had chosen twice now not to kill. Boone's convoy regrouped, shaken but whole, 3 minor injuries and not a single fatality among them. On the ridge, Price lowered his spotting scope and looked at Tegan with an expression that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with confirmation. The look of a man watching a theory he had carried for 7 weeks finally prove itself true in real time. She could have killed him, Price said quietly, still watching the tree line where the ambush had scattered. Both of them. She did not answer right away. She was already breaking down her position with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, checking her equipment, logging her rounds fired, refusing to let the moment turn into a performance simply because someone was finally watching. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same flat calm it always did, giving away nothing and everything at once. There is a difference, she said, between having the ability to end something and having the right reason to. I only had one of those today. Price looked at her for a long moment, turning that sentence over the way he turned over every piece of information that mattered. Then who gave the order, he asked. What order, she said, and something in the careful neutrality of her tone told him she had just decided in that instant not to hand him the whole truth yet. Below them, radios were crackling with confused chatter, Boone demanding to know who exactly was on that ridge. Sorensen's voice cutting through the command channel with a question that had not existed in his vocabulary 3 days earlier, a question that sounded almost like respect, trying to force its way past pride. Price watched Tegan gather the last of her gear and rise to her feet, and he understood with the same analytical clarity that had made him notice her in the first place, that whatever this 36-hour window actually was, whatever silent order had put her on this ridge with instructions to delay and protect and report to no one, it was not finished. It had barely begun. Somewhere out past the switchback, past the tree line, past the edge of what either of them could see from this position, something larger was still moving, patient and unseen. And Tegan Voss had just spent her opening move making sure nobody died before she found out exactly what it was. The debrief that followed the ambush lasted less than 20 minutes, and every minute of it felt to Tegan like standing in a room full of people trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing, because she was the only one who knew there was a hidden picture underneath the one everyone else was staring at. First Sergeant Marcus Boone gave his account with the flat precision of a man still running on adrenaline, describing the ambush position, the volume of fire, the moment his convoy should have taken casualties and somehow did not. He kept circling back to the same detail, unable to let it go. Whoever was on that ridge did not kill anyone, he said. Not one round to center mass, not one fatality. In 11 years, I have never seen an engagement end that clean. Captain Wade Sorensen sat at the head of the table with his arms crossed, listening to a version of events that did not match the man he thought he understood 3 days earlier. He asked the question everyone in the room wanted answered, and nobody could. Who authorized an Overwatch position on a routine communications drill? He said. Nobody, Boone answered. It was not on the operations order. Sorensen's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Tegan had arrived at Fort Calder, she watched something behind his eyes that looked less like command and more like doubt. Sergeant Desmond Price sat beside her through all of it, saying only what needed to be said, protecting the parts of the story that were not his to give away. When the room finally emptied, he found her outside near the motor pool, checking equipment that did not need checking, and he did not sit down beside her right away. He simply watched her work for a while, the same way he had watched her that first evening, weeks ago, gathering pieces before he spoke. You are not going to tell them, he said. It was not a question. Not yet, she answered. Sorensen thinks this was an accident of good timing. Boone thinks it was a guardian angel with a rifle. Neither of them is close, and I need them to stay confused a little longer. Confused people ask fewer of the right questions. Price studied her for a long moment, the analyst in him working through the shape of what she was not saying. That envelope you burned, he said finally, and watched her hands go still for exactly half a second before resuming her work. You saw that, she said. I see everything, he answered. That is the job. Somebody sent you an order above my clearance and mine is not low. She set down the equipment and looked at him directly, weighing something behind her eyes that he had learned to recognize as the moment before a decision. All I can tell you right now is that this was never a communications drill, she said. It was cover. Someone needed 36 hours where nobody was looking too closely at this stretch of road and somebody else did not get the message in time. because that ambush should not have happened. Cover for what? He asked. She did not answer. She looked past him toward the ridge they had occupied that morning, toward the long, empty stretch of high desert beyond it. And something in her expression told him the answer existed somewhere out there, waiting. And she was not ready to say its name out loud until she understood it herself. That evening, a supply team recovered the wreckage from the ambush site, and among the debris from the second vehicle, the one Rourke had been driving, they found a reinforced case that had not been on the manifest. It was locked, unmarked, and heavier than a case that size had any reason to be. Boone brought it directly to Sorensen instead of logging it through standard channels, some instinct telling him this belonged above his authority. Sorensen opened it in his office with only Price and Teagan present, and inside, beneath a false bottom that had clearly been designed to survive casual inspection, were sealed document folders stamped with classification markings. Markings none of them had clearance to fully read, along with a single manila envelope containing photographs. Sorensen laid the photographs across his desk one at a time, and the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with what the photographs showed. Three men in outdated fatigues, thin, unshaven, photographed through what looked like a narrow gap in reinforced concrete. Special operations officers, Sorensen said slowly, reading the partial identification tags visible in the corner of one image. These men have been listed as missing for months. Teagan looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking, and something in her chest tightened around a shape she had been circling since the moment she burned that envelope. A shape that was finally starting to resolve into something with edges. This was never about a training drill, she said quietly. This convoy was covered for something moving through this region, and whoever wrote my orders wanted this road quiet for 36 hours because they were protecting a window for something connected to these men. Sorensen looked up at her, and for the first time he was not looking at the girl who fixed rifles. He was looking at someone who had just walked into the center of a puzzle he did not know existed, and he did not like how calmly she stood inside it. Voss, he said, his voice lower now, carrying none of the mockery from 3 days earlier. What exactly do you know that you are not telling me? Not enough yet, she answered honestly, but I intend to find out before this window closes. She left his office with Price close behind her, and outside in the cold evening air, he asked her the question that had been sitting behind his eyes since the debrief. Whoever sent your orders, he said, they knew this ambush was a risk and they let it happen anyway. Why? Because whatever 36-hour window they were protecting mattered more than one convoy, she said, and I intend to find the person responsible for deciding that trade was acceptable. That night, alone in her quarters, Teagan spread a topographic map of the region across her bunk and began working backward from the ambush site, tracing every access road, every ridge line, every structure marked on old survey data that predated most of the soldiers currently stationed at Fort Calder. Buried in the southeast quadrant, nearly 40 miles from the base, was a decommissioned missile silo complex, abandoned since the collapse of a Cold War era defense program and officially stripped of all hardware decades earlier. It was the kind of location nobody thought about anymore. Exactly the kind of location someone might choose specifically because nobody thought about it anymore. She circled it once, then twice, and sat with the pencil in her hand for a long time, feeling the shape of the puzzle tighten another notch closer to something she could name. The next morning brought a routine supply inspection that under any other circumstances would have meant nothing. But Teagan had learned that the word routine applied to anything connected to this window of 36 hours deserved a second look. She watched from the motor pool as Colton Reyes, the civilian logistics contractor who had handled fuel and parts deliveries at Fort Calder for the better part of 2 years, walked the inspection line with a clipboard in a manner too relaxed for a man checking manifests during the period when the base had just absorbed live fire on a training route. She had never paid Reyes much attention before. Civilian contractors moved through military installations like background noise, present everywhere and noticed nowhere, which was precisely why they made excellent instruments for anyone wanting information to move quietly. She watched him linger near the wreckage recovery vehicles longer than his job required, watched him photograph something on his phone with the casual motion of a man documenting damage for an insurance claim, though nothing about his posture matched a man simply doing paperwork. Price found her watching from the shade of the equipment shed and followed her line of sight to Reyes without needing to ask what had caught her attention. He has had base access for 2 years, Price said quietly. Nobody's ever flagged him for anything. That is exactly why he would be useful to someone, Tegan answered. Nobody watches the man everyone has already decided is harmless. That afternoon, using clearance codes, Price still did not fully understand how she possessed. Tegan pulled Reyes's delivery logs for the past 6 weeks and cross-referenced them against known movement patterns along the western perimeter road. The pattern that emerged was subtle enough to survive a casual audit, but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. Every delivery run Reyes had made in the past month had passed within visual range of a specific stretch of the Devil's Ladder route at almost exactly the same time each week, a stretch that happened to overlook a narrow access trail leading southeast, toward the coordinates she had circled on her map the night before. She sat with the data for a long time, feeling something cold settle into place. Somebody inside this installation was feeding information outward, and the ambush that nearly cost soldiers their lives the day before had not been random. Someone had known the convoy's route and timing well enough to position an attack precisely on the window. Her mystery orders had asked her to protect. That evening she found Sergeant First Class Vera Lindqvist near the armory, the same woman who had dismissed her 7 months earlier as motor pool material, and asked her a question that had nothing to do with equipment. How long has Reyes been running fuel deliveries out here, she asked. Since before I arrived, Lindqvist answered, studying her with new attention. Why, I am trying to understand who else on this post has reason to know our convoy schedules before they are posted, Tegan said. Lindqvist's expression shifted, some old instinct waking up behind her eyes. You think somebody handed that ambush our route, she said. It was not a question anymore. I think somebody handed somebody our route, Tegan said, and I intend to find out who they handed it to. That night, Tegan and Price moved without authorization along the access trail she had identified from the map, climbing through darkness thick enough to swallow starlight, using terrain features instead of flashlights to navigate the descent toward the silo complex. They did not speak much. The wind carried sound too easily out here, and every word spent was a word that might travel farther than intended. Near a collapsed section of perimeter fencing, roughly a mile out from the silo entrance, they found tire tracks fresh enough to still hold sharp edges in the dust. Evidence of vehicles moving supplies in and out of a location that was supposed to have been empty for 30 years. Tegan crouched at the fence line and studied the tracks, then looked up toward the concrete structure rising like a low gray scar against the darker hillside beyond it. Somebody is running this place like an active site, she said quietly. Price knelt beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. If those men in the photographs are being held here, he said, this is not a training exercise anymore. This is a hostage situation on American soil, and nobody outside this fence line knows it exists. Before either of them could move closer, a beam of light swept across the fence line from somewhere near the silo entrance, and both of them dropped flat into the dust, motionless, waiting. Tegan counted the seconds by her own pulse, feeling the old discipline settle over her like a second skin. The discipline that had never once failed her in 18 months of reconnaissance work, where being seen meant the mission was already lost. The light passed. A pair of guards moved along the perimeter in a slow, deliberate patrol, rifles slung casually but competently, the posture of men who had done this before and expected nothing to interrupt the routine. Tegan watched them for nearly 10 minutes, memorizing patrol timing, counting steps between checkpoints, building a picture in her mind with the same patience she brought to every terrain assessment she had ever conducted. When the guards finally rotated out of visual range, she moved. She crossed the open ground low and fast, closing the distance to a maintenance access point near the base of the structure, where a single strand of tripwire connected to what looked, in the dim light, like a pressure-sensitive charge buried just beneath the surface dust. One wrong step, and the entire patrol would know exactly where they were standing. She knelt beside it, breathing slow, and reached into her kit for a small cutting tool, working the wire free from its housing with movements so precise and so unhurried that from 10 feet away, Price could not tell she was doing anything at all except kneeling in the dark. The wire came free without a sound, without a spark, without so much as a shift in the tension that would have triggered the mechanism, and she coiled it silently into her palm and slipped it into a pouch on her vest before rising and continuing forward, leaving no evidence behind that anyone had ever been there. Price exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. "How did you know that was live?" he whispered. "Because it was buried too carefully for a fence line nobody is supposed to care about," she answered. "People do not hide things that carefully unless they have something worth hiding." They reached a ventilation grate near the northern face of the structure, rusted but intact, and through the narrow gaps Tegan could make out a faint wash of artificial light somewhere deep below ground level, along with the muffled edge of voices too distant to distinguish clearly. "This place is active," she said quietly. "Somebody is running an operation out of a facility the government forgot existed." They retreated before dawn, moving back along the same careful route that had brought them in. And by the time they reached the observation ridge above Fort Calder, the sky had begun turning the pale gray that precedes full sunrise. Tegan sat with her back against a boulder, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the night, and Price settled beside her without speaking for a long while, both of them watching the base come slowly awake below. "Whoever sent you those orders," he finally said, "they knew about this place. They knew what was happening down there before either of us did." "I think so," she agreed. "And I think whoever wrote that order chose me specifically because I am the one soldier on this post. Nobody was watching closely enough to notice going missing for 36 hours. Price turned to look at her, something shifting behind his eyes as pieces he had been carrying separately for weeks began locking together into a single uncomfortable shape. "You already knew this location existed before you found the map," he said slowly. "It was not really a guess. That silo complex was not random to you." Tegan was quiet for a long moment, watching the horizon lighten by degrees, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight it had not carried before. The sound of someone setting down something she had been holding alone for a very long time. 18 months ago, before I ever came to Fort Calder, I trained under a warrant officer named Silas Draven, she said. He built the reconnaissance program that made me who I am. He taught me everything about patience, about reading terrain, about choosing not to kill when killing was not the answer the mission required. 2 years ago, he disappeared from active service under circumstances nobody ever explained to the people who trained beneath him. I did not know where he went. I did not know if he was alive. Price sat with that for a moment, watching her face for something he could not quite name. "And now," he said carefully, "and now I think the man running that facility down there learned everything he knows from the same place I did," she said. "I think whoever is holding those 3 officers captive is somebody I once trusted with my life." The silence that followed carried more weight than anything either of them had said all night. Below them, the base was fully awake now, soldiers moving between buildings, the ordinary rhythm of a morning that had no idea what had been discovered 40 miles southeast in the dark. Tegan rose slowly, brushing dust from her uniform, and looked down at the base with an expression that had hardened into something Price had not seen from her before. Not anger exactly, something closer to resolve settling into its final shape. "I need to get back before Sorensen notices I was gone," she said. "And I need proof, real proof, before I bring this to anyone above his rank. Because if I am wrong about who is down there, I destroy a man's reputation for nothing. And if I am right," she said, letting the sentence trail into the cold morning air, "then somebody I trained under has spent 2 years turning everything he taught me into a weapon aimed at the people I used to serve beside." That afternoon, back inside the base perimeter, Sorensen called her into his office alone, and for the first time since her arrival at Fort Calder, there was no mockery in his posture, no easy dismissal in the set of his shoulders. He had spent the previous night reading portions of her classified file that his rank finally allowed him to access, and something in what he had read had clearly rearranged the picture he carried of her. "I owe you an explanation for how I treated you 3 days ago," he said, "and I intend to give you a real one eventually. But right now I need you to tell me honestly what you know, because Boone found something in that recovered case that I do not think either of us is equipped to handle alone." She studied him for a long moment, weighing exactly how much of the truth this man had earned in the space of 3 days, and decided finally that the stakes were too high for careful rationing anymore. "There are 3 American officers being held 40 miles from this post," she said. "I believe that the man holding them is someone I trained under before I ever wore this uniform under your command. and I believe someone inside this installation has been feeding him information about our movements for at least 6 weeks. Sorensen's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, then something close to fear, then a hardening focus that Tegan recognized as a man finally understanding the true size of the situation he had laughed his way through days earlier. "Who?" he said. "I am not certain yet," she answered, "but I intend to find out before he learns that we know." That evening, as the base settled into its nighttime rhythm, Tegan positioned herself near the motor pool with a clear line of sight to the fuel depot where Reyes typically completed his final rounds before signing off for the day. She watched him move through his routine with the same relaxed efficiency as always, checking gauges, logging numbers. Nothing about his behavior suggesting anything out of place to anyone who had not spent the past 2 days building a pattern against him. Then, near the rear of the depot where the security cameras carried a known blind spot that every contractor on base had learned about within their first month, she watched him remove a small device from his jacket and press it briefly against the underside of a delivery manifest before sliding it back into his pocket and walking away as if nothing had happened at all. She waited until he was gone, then crossed to the manifest and carefully lifted it, finding tape to its underside, a small transmitter no larger than a coin, the kind of device designed to relay location data to a receiver miles away without ever touching a monitored network. She photographed it in place, left it exactly where she found it, and walked away without disturbing anything, because catching him with evidence in hand meant nothing if it also warned whoever was receiving his signals that Fort Calder had finally noticed. She brought the photographs to Sorensen and Price that night in a locked storage room away from prying eyes, and laid out everything she had gathered across a folding table: the tire tracks, the transmitter, the delivery patterns that lined up precisely with every known movement toward the silo complex. Sorensen studied it all with the focused intensity of a man watching his understanding of the past 2 years collapse and rebuild itself in real time. "Reyes has had access to this base for 2 years," he said quietly. "He has moved through every part of this installation without a single flag against him." "Because nobody thought to look," Tegan said. "That is the entire design. Nobody watches the person everyone has already decided is harmless." Price leaned over the map, tracing the route from the fuel depot to the silo complex with one finger, his analyst's mind already working several steps ahead. "If Reyes has been feeding Draven our convoy schedules," he said, "then Draven already knows we recovered that case. He already knows we found the photographs. That means he knows his window is closing, and men like that do not wait quietly when they know they have been discovered." Tegan looked at the map for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what came next settle across her shoulders. "Then we do not wait either," she said. "We move tonight before he decides those 3 officers have become a liability instead of leverage." Sorensen looked at her, and something in his face carried the specific gravity of a commanding officer finally understanding exactly what kind of soldier he had dismissed in front of an entire room 3 days earlier. "I will authorize whatever support you need," he said. "Whatever happens down there tonight, this base owes you more than an apology, and I intend to see that debt paid in full once those men are home." Tegan nodded once, already moving toward the door, her mind narrowing into the same focused clarity that had carried her through 18 months of work nobody had ever known about. Price fell into step beside her without needing to be asked, exactly as he had on the ridge 3 days earlier, exactly as he had every time since the moment he first noticed the way she studied a terrain map like a problem worth solving. They descended toward the silo complex under a moonless sky, moving low and silent through terrain Tegan had already memorized the night before, and this time there was no hesitation in her movements, no careful uncertainty about what waited below. She knew the guard patrol timing. She knew the location of every hidden charge along the fence line. She knew with a certainty that settled into her chest like cold iron, that somewhere beneath that concrete structure was a man who had once taught her everything she knew about patience and precision, and that tonight she was going to use every lesson he had ever given her against the very thing he had become. They reached the ventilation access point just after 2 in the morning, and Tegan worked the rusted grate free with slow, deliberate pressure, careful not to let metal scrape against metal loud enough to carry. Below, the artificial light she had glimpsed the night before was stronger now, spilling upward through the narrow shaft in a pale wash that revealed a maintenance corridor running deep beneath the surface. She lowered herself through the opening first, landing soft on the balls of her feet, and Price followed a moment later, both of them moving into a network of corridors that had not appeared on any official record in over 3 decades. The air smelled of rust and diesel and something colder underneath it, the particular staleness of a place that had been sealed away and then forced back open by people with no intention of ever officially acknowledging it existed. They moved deeper, past storage rooms stripped bare decades ago, and now refilled with crates that bore no government markings at all, past a junction where fresh cabling had been run along walls that predated the technology it carried by 40 years. Somewhere ahead, voices carried faintly through the concrete, low and unhurried, the sound of men who believed themselves completely secure inside a facility nobody else knew existed. Tegan pressed herself against the wall at a bend in the corridor and held up a closed fist, and Price froze instantly beside her, both of them listening as footsteps approached from the opposite direction, unhurried, confident, the walk of a man patrolling territory he considered entirely his own. She waited until the footsteps grew close enough to count, then closer still, and in the narrow beam of light spilling from the junction ahead, she finally saw the shape of the man rounding the corner. Tall, gray at the temples, moving with the same economical precision she remembered from 18 months of training beneath him. A precision she had spent years trying to earn and had somehow impossibly ended up standing across from in a corridor buried 40 miles beneath the Wyoming plateau. Silas Draven stopped walking the instant his eyes found her in the shadows, and for a long suspended moment neither of them moved. Two people who had once shared the same discipline now standing on opposite sides of something neither of them could take back. He studied her with an expression that held no surprise at all, only a slow, terrible recognition settling into place, as if some part of him had been expecting this exact corridor, this exact meeting, since long before she had ever climbed down through that ventilation shaft. Tegan Voss, he said quietly, his voice carrying the same measured calm she remembered from every lesson he had ever given her. I always wondered who they would send. Behind him, further down the corridor, a second set of footsteps began moving fast in their direction, and somewhere beyond that, an alarm klaxon tore through the silence with a scream that echoed off concrete in every direction at once, and Tegan understood, with the same cold clarity that had carried her through every dangerous moment of her career, that whatever quiet advantage they had carried into this facility had just been stripped away completely, leaving her and Price alone in a sealed underground corridor with a man who knew every single tactic she had ever been taught and nowhere left to run. The alarm tore through the corridor in long metallic waves, and Silas Draven did not flinch at the sound the way a man caught off guard would flinch. He simply stood there studying Tegan with the same patient, evaluating stare he used to give her on a rifle range 2 years earlier, as though the klaxon screaming through concrete on every side of them was nothing more than background noise to a conversation he had been expecting to have for a long time. "You came alone," he said, though his eyes flickered once toward Price and corrected himself. "Nearly alone. That was always your instinct. Small footprint, maximum effect. I taught you that. You taught me the mechanics," Tegan said, her voice level despite the alarm and the footsteps closing fast from the far end of the corridor. "You never taught me this." Draven's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Everything I do now," he said, "I learned from watching men in Washington decide which soldiers were worth remembering and which ones were worth writing off as acceptable losses. I simply stopped waiting for permission to disagree with them." The footsteps behind him resolved into 2 armed men, rounding the corner at a run, weapons rising, and Tegan moved before either of them could bring a barrel level, closing the distance to Draven in 3 strides and driving her shoulder into his chest, using his own body as cover while she drove him sideways into a support column hard enough to knock the breath from him. The first guard fired a burst that sparked off the concrete a foot wide of where she had been standing a half-second earlier, and Price returned fire from the doorway behind them, forcing both men back around the corner they had just come from. "Move," Tegan said, and she and Price broke left down a side corridor that had not been on any map either of them carried, running on instinct in the layout she had glimpsed only once through a ventilation shaft the night before. Behind them, Draven's voice rose over the alarm, not panicked, simply directing, The calm, efficient command voice of a man running a crisis exactly the way he had trained a generation of soldiers to run one. "Seal the east corridor," he called out. "Do not let them reach the holding block before I do." They ran through a service passage lined with cabling that had clearly been installed in the past year. Modern equipment threaded through walls built during a decade when the entire facility had been designed to survive a different kind of war. Tegan's mind was already working the layout, the direction of the airflow, the echo pattern of the alarm bouncing differently through different sized rooms, building a mental map faster than either of them could speak it aloud. "This way," she said, pulling Price through a narrow maintenance gap into a stairwell, descending further underground, toward the lower level where the artificial light had seemed strongest from above. "If the officers are being held anywhere in this facility, it will be close to a controlled environment, somewhere they can monitor without exposing the rest of the complex." They descended 2 flights before the stairwell opened into a corridor with reinforced doors spaced at even intervals. Small viewing slots cut into each one at eye level, and Tegan felt something settle cold and certain in her chest the moment she saw them. "Holding cells," she said quietly. Price moved to the first door and looked through the slot, then stepped back, his jaw tightening. "Empty," he said. They checked the second, then the third, each one bare and unused, dust undisturbed on the floor, until they reached the fourth door and Price went still. Through this narrow slot, 3 men sat against the far wall of a cramped concrete room, thin, unshaven, wearing fatigues that had clearly not been changed in weeks, exactly matching the faces from the photographs recovered at the ambush site. One of them, older than the other two, with a gray stubbled jaw and eyes that had learned to stop hoping and started simply enduring, lifted his head at the sound outside the door. "Who is there?" he called out, his voice cracked from disuse. Tegan pressed her palm flat against the reinforced steel. "My name is Voss," she said. "I'm getting you out of here." The lock mechanism was electronic, tied into the facility's central security grid, and she had no time and no tools to defeat it through conventional means. Behind her, the sound of boots pounding down the stairwell told her Draven's men had found the same route she had taken, and she turned to Price with the flat calm of someone who had already run every option and arrived at the only one that mattered. "I need 30 seconds, she said. "Buy me 30 seconds. Price nodded once and moved to the stairwell entrance, dropping to one knee and bracing his weapon against the corner, and Tegan turned back to the door, running her fingers along the frame until she found the housing for the electronic bolt, a narrow gap where the panel met the concrete, not designed for tampering, but not perfectly sealed either. She drove the flat edge of her combat knife into the gap and levered it hard, feeling the frame groan under the pressure. And behind her, Price's rifle cracked twice, controlled, deliberate shots that sent the first guard rounding the stairwell corner diving back for cover. She levered again, harder, and the bolt housing cracked audibly, the mechanism grinding against itself as the electronic lock lost its seat in the frame. "One more," she muttered to herself, and drove her shoulder into the door. At the same moment she wrenched the knife sideways, and the door shuddered open on damaged hinges, swinging wide into the cell. The 3 officers stared up at her with the disbelief of men who had stopped expecting rescue to arrive in any form. "Can you walk?" she said, already crouching to check the condition of the 2 younger men, while the older one pushed himself upright against the wall. "We can walk," the older man said, his voice steadying with something that sounded almost like relief finding its footing again. "Colonel Adam Ferris, these are my men. We have been here 11 weeks. "Then let us make it 12 weeks and 1 day somewhere else," Tegan said, and helped the nearest man to his feet. Behind her, Price's voice carried back down the corridor, tight with urgency. "Voss, we have more coming from the east side. We need to move now." She led the 3 officers out into the corridor, positioning Ferris and the least injured man between herself and Price, while the third, weaker from the ordeal, leaned heavily against her shoulder, and together the small group began moving back the way they had come, toward the stairwell and the ventilation shaft that represented their only path back to the surface. They had covered perhaps 40 meters when Draven's voice rang out from somewhere behind them. Close enough that the alarm no longer fully masked it. "You cannot get them out through the route you came in," he called. "I already have men sealing that shaft." Tegan did not slow her pace, but she felt the weight of the sentence land regardless, because she believed him, because everything she knew about the man told her he would not bluff about something that easily verified. "There has to be another way out," she said quietly to Price, and he was already scanning the corridor ahead, his analyst's mind running through the layout they had glimpsed on the way in. "The original silo access shaft," he said. "If this facility still has its primary launch tube intact, there would have been a secondary maintenance elevator built for equipment transport. It would come up somewhere on the surface outside the perimeter fence, away from where the guards are concentrated." "Can you find it?" she asked. "I can try," he said. And that was the moment the corridor lighting flickered once, twice, then died entirely, plunging the entire passage into total darkness, broken only by the pale wash of an emergency strip along the floor. Somewhere ahead, Draven's voice carried through the dark with an edge of something that had not been there before, a controlled fury finally breaking its careful surface. "You do not understand what you are interfering with, Voss," he called. "This was never about those three men. This was about proving that the people running this country would rather let good soldiers rot in a hole than admit what they cost to protect. I was building leverage. I was going to force them to answer for it." Tegan kept moving through the dark, one hand trailing the wall to keep the group oriented, her voice carrying back toward the sound of his without hesitation. "You are not fighting for them," she said. "You stopped fighting for anyone the moment you decided their lives were a bargaining chip instead of a debt you owed." Silence answered her, heavy and cold, and then the sound of boots moving fast somewhere to their left, cutting an angle that would intercept them before they reached the stairwell. "Price," Tegan said sharply, and he was already turning, weapon raised, and in the darkness the muzzle flash lit the corridor in brief, violent strobes as he engaged whoever was closing from that direction, buying seconds that felt impossibly small against the distance they still needed to cover. Tegan pushed the group forward, feeling her way along a junction she remembered from the layout, and found the maintenance elevator exactly where Price's instinct had placed it, a narrow steel cage behind a door marked with faded stenciling that had not been legible in decades. The control panel beside it was manual, mechanical, built for an era before anything could be hacked or overridden remotely, and she threw the lever hard, feeling the old motor grind reluctantly to life somewhere far above them. "Get them inside," she called back to Price, who was retreating toward her now, firing controlled bursts to slow the pursuit without wasting rounds he could not spare. The cage rattled and shuddered as it began its slow climb, carrying Ferris and his two men upward through the dark shaft. And Tegan stood at the base with Price, watching the gap close between the elevator car and the guards now converging from two directions at once. "Next one," Tegan said, and Price nodded, already backing toward the shaft entrance. But before he could reach it, Draven himself stepped into the pale emergency light at the far end of the corridor, alone, unarmed, his hands open at his sides in a gesture that looked almost like surrender, except for the steadiness in his eyes. "There is no version of this where you walk out and I simply let it happen," he said. "You know that. I know you believe that," Tegan answered. And there was no anger in her voice, only the same flat clarity she had carried onto every ridge and every range for the past 6 years. "But I also know you taught me that when the mission is compromised, you do not force a confrontation you cannot win. You taught me to disengage and preserve the objective. That lesson still applies to you too, whether you want it to or not." Draven's jaw tightened, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes that looked almost like the man she remembered from 18 months of training, before whatever had broken inside him had fully taken hold. "I am not going to disengage," he said quietly. "This is the only leverage I have left." "Then I am sorry," she said, and meant it, and raised her weapon in the same motion she had used on the ridge 3 days earlier, not aiming for center mass, not aiming to end him, but for the narrow gap between his shoulder and the wall where his weapon hand would need to move to bring a hidden sidearm into play. And when his hand shifted toward his jacket, she fired once, and the round caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways into the concrete wall, disarmed and bleeding but alive, exactly the way she had chosen every outcome since the moment this mission began. He slid down the wall to sit against it, pressing his good hand against the wound, looked up at her with an expression that held no anger at all, only something closer to exhausted recognition. "Still choosing not to kill," he said, his voice tight with pain. "Even now, because that was always the better lesson." she answered. You just forgot which one mattered. Price pulled her back toward the shaft as the remaining guards, seeing their commander down and disarmed, hesitated long enough for the two of them to reach the elevator car on its return descent and ride it upward through the dark, leaving Draven alone in the corridor behind them, his voice fading into the distance, along with the last of the alarm klaxons as the cage rose toward the surface. They emerged into cold pre-dawn air through a rusted hatch nearly 100 meters outside the perimeter fence, exactly where Price had predicted, and found Ferris and his two men waiting exactly where the first elevator car had delivered to them, exhausted but upright, staring up at open sky for what Ferris would later say was the first time in 11 weeks he had allowed himself to believe it was real. Sorensen had authorized a support element the moment Tegan left the base the night before, and the sound of rotor blades cutting through the dark toward their position arrived within minutes. A response team converging on the coordinates Price had radioed the instant they cleared the hatch. Federal agents and a joint task force element secured the silo complex within the hour, moving in force once daylight broke, taking Draven's remaining men into custody, along with a wounded Draven himself, still alive, still lucid enough to be questioned about the full scope of what he had built underground over 2 years of operating in a facility the government had officially forgotten existed. Colton Races was arrested at the fuel depot that same morning, caught mid-transmission with a device identical to the one Tegan had photographed days earlier. And within hours, investigators had traced enough evidence through his financial records to build a case that would keep him answering questions for a very long time. One detail surfaced during the initial task force debrief that Tegan had not expected. Colonel Ferris, still recovering in the medical tent set up near the extraction point, asked to speak with her privately before the transport of helicopters arrived. I need to tell you something before this becomes an official record, he said. The order that sent you onto that ridge, the one you burned. I wrote it. Tegan went very still. You, she said. I have spent 2 years quietly building a case against Draven from the inside of a system that refused to believe one of its own could turn, Ferris said. When my team was taken, I managed to get word out through a contact before I lost a contact entirely, enough to trigger a standing directive I had prepared months earlier, one that named you specifically. I had read your file long before Fort Calder ever did. I knew you would ask the right questions and trust the wrong feelings. I am sorry I could not tell you more. I am sorry the ambush happened at all. That was never supposed to be part of this. Tegan looked at him for a long moment, feeling something in her chest finally settle into place after 36 hours of carrying a question with no name attached to it. Next time, she said, without heat, just tell the soldier what she is walking into. Ferris held her eyes and nodded slowly. Next time, he agreed, if there is one. Back at Fort Calder, the base moved through the following days in a state that felt less like celebration and more like a slow, collective reckoning with what had actually happened only a few miles beyond the wire, while most of the post slept soundly in its beds. Colonel Ferris and his two men were transferred to a medical facility for evaluation, and word came back within a week that all three would make a full recovery, physically at least, the deeper wounds being the kind that would take considerably longer to heal. Sorensen requested a formal meeting with Tegan on the 4th day after the rescue, and this time when she walked into his office, there was no laser pointer, no cold coffee, no easy confidence sitting in his posture. He stood when she entered, which was not required by any protocol between their ranks, and for a long moment he simply looked at her before he spoke. I have spent 4 days reading your full file, he said. Every page I finally had clearance to see. I want to say something to you directly. Not as a report, not as a formality. 3 days before all of this began, I stood in a room and laughed at your name in front of every soldier under my command. I did that because I looked at you and decided I already knew everything worth knowing, and I never once considered that I might be wrong. Tegan listened without interrupting, her expression steady, giving him the space to finish what he had clearly been rehearsing since the moment he first opened her file. That was not a small mistake, he continued. That was a failure of leadership, and it very nearly cost this base 3 soldiers, an ambushed convoy, and 3 American officers who would still be sitting in that cell right now. If you had decided my opinion of you was reason enough to stop doing your job, you did not stop. You never stopped, not for 1 day in 7 months, and I owe you an apology that is not going to undo what I said. but I intend to make sure it is never repeated against anyone else who walks through that door." Tegan was quiet for a moment, weighing the words the same way she weighed everything, testing them for the difference between something said and something meant. "I accept that," she said finally, "but I have one condition." Sorensen nodded, waiting. "Do not just apologize to me," she said. "Fix the system that let it happen. There are soldiers on this post right now sitting in the wrong assignments because somebody decided what they were capable of before anyone bothered to look at their record. Build something that makes it harder for the next commander to make the same mistake I watched you make." Sorensen was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a weight that had not been there 3 days earlier. "That is not a condition," he said. "That is exactly what I already asked command authorization to begin building, and I would like you to help design it." In the weeks that followed, Tegan was formally recommended for a specialized training and evaluation role that would take her beyond Fort Calder to other installations across the region, developing assessment protocols built on demonstrated capability rather than assumption. A program that would eventually become required reading for command staff at 3 additional posts within the year. Private Eli Rourke, the young soldier whose panic had nearly turned his own weapon against his fellow soldiers during the ambush, requested a meeting with her before she departed for her first evaluation assignment at a neighboring installation. And he arrived at her quarters with the same careful, controlled posture of a man who had spent every night since the ambush replaying the moment his hands froze on the wheel. "I need you to know I understand what almost happened because of me," he said. "Not as something I was told, as something I understand." She listened to him without offering easy comfort, because comfort was not what he needed. And when he finished, she answered him with the same flat honesty she gave everyone. "You were placed in a position you were not prepared for," she said. "That is a training failure, not a character flaw. And if you spend the next year treating it as the second thing instead of the first, you will become a worse soldier, not a better one. What you do with that understanding from here forward is the only part that is actually yours to control." Rourke nodded slowly, something in his shoulders loosening for the first time since the ambush, and he left her quarters carrying a weight that had finally redistributed itself into something he could actually manage. Private Sam Delgado, the young soldier who had stopped her in the corridor after the briefing room laughter and told her plainly that what happened was not right, found her on the morning training ground days later, running the same solitary route she had run every morning since her arrival, and without a word he fell into pace beside her, matching her stride, and neither of them spoke for the full distance because nothing needed to be said. By the time she finished her preparations to depart for the first of what would become several installations adopting her evaluation framework, Fort Calder had visibly shifted in ways that had nothing to do with formal policy and everything to do with the accumulated weight of small decisions made by people who had watched the truth arrive on its own schedule and finally understood what it had cost to wait that long. Sergeant First Class Lindqvist, who had once dismissed her as motor pool material, sat in on Tegan's final evaluation session before departure, and afterward found her packing gear near the motor pool and said simply, "I was wrong about you 7 months ago, and I have thought about that more than I would like to admit." Tegan looked at her, and something in her expression softened just slightly. Not forgiveness exactly, something closer to acknowledgement. "Most people are wrong about someone at some point," she said. "What matters is what you do once you find out." Price was the one who drove her to the transport point on her final morning at Fort Calder, and the two of them stood for a while beside the vehicle without speaking, the same comfortable silence that had carried them through every significant moment of the past several weeks. 7 months, he finally said. 7 months of being invisible, and then 36 hours that changed everything. She considered that for a moment, watching the pale morning light stretch long shadows across the training ground where she had run alone every single day before anyone else on that post was awake. It was never really about the 36 hours, she said. It was about being ready long before anyone thought to ask. Price studied her with the same analytical attention he had given her from the very first week he noticed her tracing elevation lines on a terrain map like a problem worth solving. "Where does the program send you first?" he asked. "An installation 2 states west," she said. "New command staff, new soldiers nobody has bothered to look at closely yet. He nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation exactly what kind of work that would be. I would like to stay in contact, he said, as a colleague or otherwise. She held his gaze for a moment, something quiet and unguarded, crossing her face for just an instant before the familiar composure settled back into place. I would like that too, she said. She climbed into the transport vehicle, and as it pulled away from Fort Calder, she looked back once at the base that had spent 7 months believing she was nothing more than the soldier who fixed rifles. The base that now understood, in ways both large and small, exactly what it had been standing beside the entire time without ever bothering to look. On her desk back at the base, unopened, a courier had left a plain envelope that morning, bearing no return address and a single classification stamp she did not immediately recognize. And she had chosen to leave it sealed until she reached her new posting, some quiet instinct telling her that whatever waited inside its folded pages would not be the last time a silent order arrived asking her to disappear into work nobody else would ever fully understand. The transport carried her west along the same high desert roads that had once seemed to stretch toward nothing in particular. And somewhere behind her, in a base finally learning to look before it judged, the story of the soldier who fixed rifles had already begun changing into something else entirely. Something that would follow her name into every installation she was sent to build again from nothing.